In August this year, the Australian government refused 3 Sri Lankan trade unionists visas to attend a conference in Melbourne. Department records stated that these delegates had failed to demonstrate sufficient personal, family or financial incentives to return to Sri Lanka. The department's assessment said that the delegates hadn't previously travelled outside Sri Lanka for similar reasons and therefore didn't have a record of demonstrating that they would comply with immigration laws. This was proven false on further investigation. Anton Marcus, one of the unionists who was refused a visa and the secretary of the Free Trade Zones and General Services Union in Sri Lanka, had travelled to the US the previous month and had been to Australia 4 times in the past, all on trade union business. What was omitted from the department's record was that the 3 delegates were among 300 workers that had been sacked by Ansell Lanka in a workplace dispute. Ansell Lanka is a subsidiary of the Australian company Ansell. There's an ongoing international campaign to have these workers reinstated. And 2 of the delegates that were due to speak at the conference about the dispute have actually been working, or had been working for the company for more than 20 years making rubber gloves. Union representatives from Australia and Sri Lanka believed and stated that the decision to not grant the delegates visas was political. They said that Ansell had intervened in the decision out of fear that the sacked workers' attendance at the conference would further highlight this dispute in Australia. I want to start from here to consider 3 intersecting factors at play in this situation that form the context of what I want to talk about today. These factors highlight the way that racism intersects with neoliberalism in the lives of people seeking asylum, but also in the lives of people like these trade unionists from Sri Lanka, whose citizenship and socio-economic means deem them suspect in the travel corridors of the globalised world economy. The first is the economic and geographic discrimination that's practiced by the Department of Immigration and other such departments in the world that profiles potential travellers in terms of the risk that they pose to the enforcement of immigration laws. Roughly translated, this means that the majority of travellers from the Global South, stereotyped as the global poor, have trouble getting visas through legal channels and have restrictions imposed on how and where they travel. Having insufficient personal wealth is sufficient reason to have a visa denied, even if one has every reason to return home. As well as being disproportionately subject to economic and geographic profiling, travellers from the Global South are subject to racial profiling. Government policy towards refugees, particularly in the last 20 years, has directly contributed to this and to the production of a racialised public hostility that targets refugees, particularly those travelling by boat specifically, but more generally targets all travellers from the Global South and makes them vulnerable to racist attacks and moral panics about their desire and ability to cross borders. This is manifested in an attitude, particularly in Australia, where what we've seen is, an attitude where people believe that all people from the Global South that are travelling are asylum seekers, but also believing that the majority of those seeking asylum are not refugees. And this has unfortunately surfaced again and again in polls in the past, where up to 50 to 60% of Australians don't believe that people seeking asylum are genuine refugees, even when the facts have told a completely different story over and over again. The third thing that we can see in the situation is the capillary power of transnational corporations and their ability to exert pressure, both visible and invisible, on the restructured states of the neoliberal world. We don't know definitively what power Ansell exerted on the department's decision, but we do know that states today define themselves as gatekeepers of the free market economy, much more than they claim to be champions of rights or refuges of justice. Australia's detention system is a microcosm of this intersection of racism and neoliberalism. The introduction of mandatory detention in 1992 coincided with the Keating government's plans to restructure the Australian state towards the global economy. From the beginning, the policy was specifically aimed at people arriving by boat without visas and marked them racially, economically and geographically as targets under the Amended Migration Act. Targets of the state that had to be deterred and detained in order to enforce borders. In the process, the state grew a large privatised detention network that today turns over millions in profits for the companies that operate it. When the system was privatised in 1998, the first contract went out to Australasian Correctional Services, and as a result, operating costs for detention centres rose steeply from $9.26 million in June 1997 to $14.39 million in June 1998. But at the turn of the millennium, operating costs, even when outsourced, were still nothing compared to what we've seen today. So the cost of holding one person in onshore detention for a year was $38,000 at that time. 16 years later, this has changed significantly. The cost of onshore detention for one person for 1 year is now $239,000 and offshore $400,000. Before arriving at these costs, detention centre management changed hands and form a number of times. But what didn't change is a serious abuse and mismanagement that we have seen characterise this system from its inception. And that was what saw ACS, the Australian Correctional Services, lose their contract to Group 4 Falck. That was a company that would later become G4S in 2003. The value of the contract that was paid out to G4S exceeded $300 million by 2009. Serco replaced G4S in 2009. They were given 2 5-year contracts, one for the detention centres at $279 million and another for residential housing at $44.5 million. But these contracts were renegotiated in 2011 and the detention budget grew exponentially once more, with new 5-year contracts for the period remaining up until 2014, giving them $1.03 billion to run the detention centres and $85.6 million for the residential housing. The detention centre also grew in scope, with 2 new contractors brought in to provide health and support services at $700 million. And what we've seen today is the expansion of this network to a large and complex circuit of contractors and subcontractors. The addition of offshore processing centres at Manus Island and Nauru has added significantly to the network in both cost and size. At each phase in the growth of the private detention system, what we've seen is a shift to increasingly punitive government policies designed to degrade and humiliate anyone who dares to want a better life. And with these policies have come public campaigns demonising refugees and justifying their harsh treatment and incarceration, followed by polls that always seem to confirm that such tactics are effective. The most punitive policy to date, the government's Operation Sovereign Borders, has entailed a secretive series of measures that falls just short of openly declaring that the government is aware and doesn't care that its policies flout every single protocol and convention designed to protect the rights of refugees. To enforce it, they signed 2 contracts with Transfield in February this year for the management of the camps on Nauru and Manus Island, to the value of $1.2 billion for 20 months. This came after the death of Reza Barati at the hands of G4S guards who were running the facility until then. And that was only the first of 2 deaths at the centre this year, the most recent being Hamid Kazahi, who died after failing to receive medical attention for 2 weeks for a foot infection. When he was finally transferred to hospital, it was already too late. And these 2 deaths have come amid numerous reports about appalling conditions and abuse at both of the offshore centres and, of course, the onshore ones as well. But it seems that if opinion polls are to be believed, this isn't even enough. Earlier this year, a poll of 1,000 people found that 60% of respondents wanted refugees to be treated even more harshly than that. And 60% of respondents said that refugees should not receive welfare. The concern about refugees receiving welfare is ironic, considering that detention spending is at a record high and that this spending is adding market value and generating profits for the likes of G4S, Serco and Transfield, who often pay little or no tax, sometimes get tax refunds, and all of that amounts to corporate welfare. This is government spending designed to humiliate, degrade and brutalise people on an industrial scale. The shift towards punitive policies can't be separated from the neoliberal logic of private network expansion, nor can either operate without appealing to the anxiety and fear of individuals and the deep systemic racism that drives that fear. In a world of selective rights, the management of life has become big business. But for those whose lives are at the centre of this, for them to become commodities of market exchange for the detention sector, they first have to be made such, to exist as such, through an architecture of enclosure. This means that possibilities are shut down for them, the world is shut off for them, and those who have to leave home and seek asylum are told to wait indefinitely in detention camps, or else risk entering the detention economy and becoming numbers in the accounts of private contractors. I don't think anyone will contest that we need to seriously continue fighting in this situation and to disrupt the interconnecting spheres of racism and neoliberalism that characterise Australia's immigration practices. A range of tactics and strategies are necessary and indeed are already being practiced across the refugee movement as a whole. We've seen important campaigns earlier this year that was pushing for divestment from detention with the notable example being the successful campaign calling for the boycott of the Biennale of Sydney over their funding relationship with the detention provider Transfield, and that eventually led to the Biennale parting ways with Transfield. Also, there's an ongoing campaign by unionised university workers to have UniSuper divest from the same company. These campaigns demonstrate just how deeply embedded the economic structures that target refugees are and how deep their cultural and social impact are in spheres that one doesn't normally associate with detention. They've been particularly successful because they've reached people who oppose detention but haven't necessarily been involved in the refugee rights movement, because they've made the link between silence and complicity very clear. But we should never forget the power of solidarity, the movement for refugee rights, of civil disobedience, and of other strategies that disrupt the social, cultural and economic entwining of anti-refugee policies and politics. Racism isn't just neoliberalism's facade, it is its operating logic. If as a society we were clear that no one should be treated like our government currently treats those seeking asylum, then global security giants wouldn't be in the business of warehousing human capacity, nor would they be generating profits from the proliferation of human misery. The latest phase of capitalism, like those before it, has created its own unique industry and suffering. While the divestment and boycott strategy is both necessary and effective, ultimately it remains within the logic of capitalism. It calls on consumers to make active choices within a market system. We also need a social movement for refugee rights, because only such a movement that sees both those inside and outside the system not as consumers but as active participants with shared histories and common futures that would benefit from disrupting not only the flows of capital but of capitalism itself will be truly effective in bringing justice for refugees. Thank you.